our Redeemer. Now, in this season of Lent, we've been talking about the ways that we must die spiritually to certain realities in our lives in order to begin to really live into what God has for us. And one thing that we have to do, I'm convinced, is die to darkness. And the reason that we have to die to darkness is that we have to learn to live in the light, to walk into the light, to come into the light. Now, walking in God's light would seem easy enough. You just decide to do it, right? Who wouldn't want to walk in the light? But Jesus is much more realistic about human nature. He knows that people will sometimes choose the darkness even though they're given the option of light. And Jesus teaches that walking in God's light is going to take both surrender and struggle. Now, I think we see this in the Gospel of John. There's this scene that happens in the dark, and the teacher of the Hebrew law, Nicodemus, I wonder if we could dim the front light so we could see that a little bit better. The teacher of the Hebrew law, Nicodemus, he comes to Jesus at night, and it's almost this back alley, kind of a undercover of darkness encounter that he has with Jesus. Nicodemus is interested in talking to Jesus, but he has to keep his reputation up, right? He's got a standing among the other teachers of the law in Jerusalem, and he wants to maintain that. So he can't exactly just be seen talking to Jesus out in the open on a street corner or something like that. I mean, this is the same man, Jesus, that the Jewish ruling elite in Jerusalem, they either want to ignore him or disparage him, or some of them want to kill him. And so Nicodemus can't just be seen talking to him out in the open, and so instead, he comes to Jesus by night. And Jesus, in this conversation with Nicodemus, teaches about rebirth to new life, what the rebirth that happens through the waters of baptism. And Jesus teaches about the Holy Spirit who blows where he chooses. And Jesus teaches how the Son of Man, that's him, will be lifted up on the cross to die for the salvation of the world, just as Moses long ago had lifted up that bronze serpent for the sake of the salvation of the people of God. And then Jesus speaks some of the most famous lines in the New Testament. John 3:16, right? Some of the most famous lines in the New Testament. Do you know what John 3:16 says? I mean, you heard it, you maybe memorized it. It's that passage that people write on signs and hold up at baseball games, and I have no idea if that works to hold up a sign that says John 3:16. It kind of seems to me that if you know what the reference is, you're probably already a Christian. If you don't know, it might not make any sense to you. So I don't know if it works or not, but it's this very famous passage. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. And you can tell what version I memorized that in, back in the King James long ago. But we hear John 3:16, this message of God's love for the world, which is so powerful and so important, but it goes right with John 3:17. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. We often leave that one out. I memorized 3:16, but not 3:17. And this whole passage, this encounter that Jesus has with Nicodemus, it really hinges on these two verses. I mean, in some ways, this is the central declaration of the New Testament. God loved the world. God sent his Son, Jesus, to save the world, and everyone who believes in him, who commits their life to Jesus, trusts in Jesus, follows Jesus, everyone who does that will be saved. I mean, that's really the message of the gospel in a nutshell right there. That's really, in some ways, what the entire Old Testament points to, right? I mean, Jesus is the center of history, the one who God sends into the world, the one the prophets were anticipating, the people of Israel longing for, the Messiah. All the Old Testament, in a lot of ways, points towards this verse. And in some ways, the whole New Testament unfolds from this verse. So Jesus is the Son who comes into the world for the salvation of the world, the one who calls everyone into loving relationship with him. And so then how do we live? Right? That's what Paul's letter. So then what do we do? You see this in the book of Acts. What does this mean? You see this unfolding throughout the entire New Testament, ending in Revelation, and in some ways continuing in the life of the church, understanding what it means to live out that grace we found in Jesus, who God sent because of his love. God so loved the world that he sent Jesus, that whoever believes in him will have everlasting life. But you all know this, right? I mean, it's the hope that we get up here and proclaim every Sunday. God so loved the world, he sent Jesus. It's the Easter hope of resurrection. It's the hope that we cling to whenever we lose a loved one. Because of Jesus, there is more. There is life, there is resurrection, there is eternity with him. And it sounds straightforward enough, right? I mean, what's not to like about that? That's Jesus' declaration, his teaching. But then verse 19, Jesus says this is the verdict or the judgment or the final word on this. Light has come into the world, but men loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. So light calls to light, but humanity is not so sure that it wants to step into that light, stand in that light. Because to come into the light is to have some things revealed that we might like to keep covered up. You know, truth is a powerful antiseptic, and whenever the light of truth, and especially God's eternal truth, whenever that shines on our lives, not everything that we see there is pretty. It's not that it's just people kind of out there who've got some evil deeds, some darkness that they want to cover up. It's not that they're out there. It's us. I mean, it's all of us at some point in our lives. We're all carrying stuff around in our lives that we'd rather others not find out about. Some skeleton in the closet, and yeah, sure, we didn't kill anyone, but we've been cruel. We've been greedy. We've been self-centered. Whatever your thing is, I know you know what I'm talking about. And a lot of emotional energy goes into keeping those things under wraps. I mean, it's Psalm 32 that says, happy are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sin is covered. And then David goes on, he says, while I kept silence, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. But then he says, I confessed my sin to God, and that weight was lifted. He experienced healing. It's bodily. But you know, this is more than about just confessing our sins. I mean, confession is part of it, but the deeper meaning is this openness to God, this vulnerability to God. That is what coming into the light is. The deeper meaning is surrender. And that is why Jesus tells Nicodemus in verse 21, whoever lives by the truth comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly that what he has been done through God. It's been plainly seen by God. It's this moment where our whole lives are transparent to God. It's surrender to God. You see, to walk in the light, we have to surrender to God. Now think about surrendering to God. A lot of us are willing to argue with God. We're willing to challenge God. We're willing to doubt God, but surrender to God? Now, hold on, I'm not so sure about that part of it. I mean, this idea of surrender to God, that kind of goes against our natural pride, our sense of self. We're not always sure we want to surrender to God. Nicodemus wasn't so sure he wanted to surrender to God. He's right there. He's right there on the cusp of surrendering to God. He comes by night to visit Jesus. He's open to Jesus. He wants to learn from Jesus, but he wasn't quite able to surrender all to him. Still has some resistance, something holding him back. He's got to guard his standing in the community. He's got to save face, and so he comes in secret. Comes by night, under cover of darkness. Nicodemus' journey of surrendering to God and walking into the light. It was literally, for him, it was literally a journey of walking into the light. Committing himself to Jesus was something that he had to do little by little. This slow surrender. Now, for the early Anabaptists, our spiritual ancestors, folks in the 16th century, a lot of them spoke German, and they used this word to speak of surrender to God. It's a word called Gelassenheit. And you maybe have heard of that before. It's called Gelassenheit. It means surrender to God. Gelassenheit. I wonder if we can just say that together. Gelassenheit. Yeah. So Gelassenheit means yieldedness, means surrender. Gelassenheit means this openness to the will of God, wherever that happens to take us. It's this surrender to God, Gelassenheit. And for the early Anabaptists, these were folks who were trying to follow Jesus apart from the state church, and in the 16th century, that had a lot of risks came with it. So Gelassenheit took courage. I mean, they had no idea what would happen tomorrow. They could lose their lives or their livelihoods in order to practice their faith. They faced the threat of persecution. There's a lot of people today who still face that threat of persecution, and they had no way of knowing what would come down the road, what would come tomorrow, they would wake up to. And so to surrender themselves to the will of God was really to put their lives in God's hands. That's Gelassenheit for them. That is what it means to surrender to God. And that kind of surrender, that flows out of Jesus' own experience on the cross. It's something that's modeled on the way of life we see in Jesus, right? So Jesus, on the cross, he stretches out his arms, literally. He stretches out his arms on the cross to do God's will and embrace God's will for himself, embrace the whole world in sacrificial love. But the way of the cross begins before the cross. I mean, we see Jesus living out the way of the cross when he surrenders himself to God's way and will in the desert, a way and will that are going to include suffering rather than the devil's way of power and convenience. We saw it when Jesus turned his face toward Jerusalem in the Gospel of Luke chapter 9, even though he knew that he would be killed. We saw it when Jesus prayed on that night in the garden. And he said, "Take this cup from me if you can, but if not, not my will, but yours be done." And then we saw it on the cross when Jesus completely gave himself over to the will of God. He surrendered to God. And I bet you've had moments in your life like this. I bet you've had moments where you had to just let go and let God. Moments when you had to release everything to God. Moments when you stepped out into the light and it was almost this act of spiritual desolation. And it's probably no coincidence that many of the church's great mystics, people who have had these profound encounters with God, a lot of them had that encounter in an illness. So they were people who found themselves powerless, sometimes hopeless, who were bedridden. There's nothing that they could do to change their circumstances or fix their situation. Their only option is to turn towards God's light and surrender. It's like that old hymn, "I surrender all." They commit themselves to God. This moment of surrender, I think, comes when we realize that we don't have what it takes to do it on our own. It's when we realize that we need the power of Christ in us. And this is why Jesus says in the Gospel of John chapter 15, verse 5, that those who abide in me will bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. And he means that nothing quite literally. When we think about surrender, just think about the example of Jesus' own disciples. All of them had to give up something to follow Jesus. I heard somebody the other day say that the one common denominator in the book of Acts, you look at the book of Acts and you see all these people trying to follow Jesus, and they said the one thing that they all have in common is that none of them are doing what they want to do. They're all doing what God is calling them to do. And a lot of them wish they could be somewhere else. But to follow Jesus is to let something go. And Peter, Jesus' dear friend, his disciple, you guys help me along to the next slide. Peter, he experienced this especially. He had this sense of control, this sense of expertise, this sense of mastery. And he thought he could, start to follow Jesus with all of that. He's a fisherman. But Jesus comes down to the side of the Sea of Galilee, and he says to Peter, after Peter had been fishing all night long, he said, "Peter, cast those nets out into the deeper water." He says, "Peter, here's what I want you to do. Put those nets out on the other side of the boat into the deeper water." And Peter says, very respectfully, "Look, you're a carpenter. I'm a fisherman. We've been fishing all night long. We haven't caught a thing. Why do you think this is going to work? But because you have asked us to do it, because we respect you, we'll give it a try. You all know what happens next. Those nets are so filled that they strain the strength of the men in the boats, and another boat has to come and help them. It's this moment where he has to surrender his sense of expertise and mastery to begin to walk on the road of discipleship with Jesus. That was Peter. Now, the flip side of this, the other side of this, is that walking into the light of God is also going to take struggle. It's not just surrender, it's also struggle. We're going to have to find our way forward. We're going to have to push our way through. We have to make a path. This is why Paul, that great apostle, Paul talks about coming to faith as putting on the armor of God. It's the armor of light. He says you got to have the breastplate of righteousness. You got to have the belt of truth. You got to grasp the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. You got to put on those boots to proclaim peace. It's going to be a battle. It's going to be a struggle. There are powerful spiritual forces that will seek to hold us back from walking in the light of God. Shame will well up within us. We'll feel despair. We'll imagine that nothing we do matters. We'll experience a desire to just give up, to just move on. And so we have to muster whatever spiritual strength we can find and set out on a way, discover a path. There will be struggle. This is why the ancient desert fathers, people who went out into the deserts of Egypt to cling to Jesus, to be completely focused on him and dedicated to Jesus in prayer, they didn't speak about praying as kind of something sleepy, something that they would do to find inner peace. Prayer for them was this internal struggle between their own worst impulses, between the power of the devil and themselves. They said that prayer was struggle to their dying breath. This is why in the book of Revelation, one of the very common virtues that is mentioned in Revelation is endurance. Jesus says, I know your works, your love, faith, service, and patient endurance. Or that response to the first beast in the book of Revelation is a call to endurance and faith of the saints. This is why Hebrews tells us to fling aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Or why Paul writes in Romans, rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer. Now, the strength to endure and persevere and run, that strength to do what matters ultimately comes from God. We don't have it within ourselves. It comes from God's grace, and there will be struggle, and coming into the light is hard. There will be resistance, but it is going to be God who provides us with the strength to be able to struggle forward. So back on Ash Wednesday, as we began this journey of Lent, we were gathered here and we were reflecting and remembering on our own mortality, the fact that all of us will die. And we began to walk that cross with Jesus. And sometimes people talk about giving something up for Lent, give up chocolate or something. But I encouraged us all to take one step towards Jesus during Lent. Just look at our lives, look at your life, and say, where is a step that I need to take toward Jesus during this Lent? What's holding you back? Figure that out and make that step. Right? What is it that you need to recognize and get out of the way so that you can take a step? Where do you need to enter into spiritual conflict, spiritual struggle to walk towards Jesus? I believe there's something, because I know within my own heart there is always something. I mean, is it fear that's holding you back? Is it mistrust? Is it anger? Is it envy or lust or pride? What is holding you back from stepping into the light of Christ? Where do you have to struggle? Because there are things that hold us back from God, things that cause us to stumble, that block our paths. The very nature of the devil is to block our path to God. That word devil actually comes from diabolos in Greek, And that word diabolos means slanderer or throw across, right? The devil is the one who throws an obstacle across our path to God. But greater is the one who is in us than the one who is in the world. We should expect struggle. In fact, we should experience struggle. We'll know we're going to experience struggle, but we believe that God's power is stronger to help us overcome. And sometimes when there's struggle, sometimes that means something productive is happening in our lives, right? It's like, a productive cough, right? Like, something's actually happening, right? When you're really coughing. Sometimes it's productive struggle. And transformation might be taking place, or maybe there is something in our lives that's going against the grain, and so there's friction, there's struggle, there's sparks. Nothing that matters will happen without struggle. And a lot of times we can get the idea that if we're struggling with something, maybe that means that we're failing. Maybe that means we're too weak. Spiritually strong people don't struggle, right? But think about it. If we're up to our ears in sin, if we're living in a situation that's sinful, then we're not struggling against it. We're just going with the flow. Any dead fish can go with the flow. It's the live fish that struggles to swim upstream. It's the live fish that notices the counter current. And so I think sometimes struggle means we're swimming upstream. I think about this story of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And Nehemiah comes back to Jerusalem from Persia, and he was sent back to repair the walls of Jerusalem. He rides his horse around the outside of the walls and inspects the walls, and he sets out to repair the walls of his beloved city, Jerusalem. But Nehemiah faces opposition. He faces challenge. Not everybody wants to see Nehemiah succeed. Not everybody likes Nehemiah. And kind of right in the middle of the book of Nehemiah, in chapter 6, verse 9, Nehemiah prays something, and I think it's a really powerful prayer. I've kind of claimed this prayer as my own. Nehemiah prays, "Now, O God, strengthen my hands." And I love that prayer. "Now, O God, strengthen my hands." It's Nehemiah 6:9. I love that because I recognize that I need that prayer. Because I know that there are places that I struggle. I know that I need God's strength to gird me up, to help me forward, to help me get across obstacles. Now, oh God, strengthen my hands. Whenever I struggle about my own fears, about my capabilities, my fear about whether I have what it takes to do what needs to be done, fear about whether I'm doing what God wants me to do, or at least if I'm doing it well, and I do struggle with these things. Whenever I have those fears, I pray this prayer. "Now, O God, strengthen my hands." It's one of my prayers for the struggle. Walking in God's light takes surrender. It also takes struggle. Both of these, the surrender and the struggle, they have their roots in the love of God. So God has reached out to us in love, and we start to move towards him in love. God's love has been kindled in us. It is drawing us towards God. And so we struggle towards God because God has first loved us. We struggle towards God because God has graced us with his strength. St. Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystic, she said that the more you struggle, the more you prove the love you bear toward God. We need both surrender and struggle to find our way into Jesus' light. So where are you at right now? Where's your life at? Where are the places that you need to surrender to Jesus? Where do you need to give something over to Jesus? To allow Jesus to take hold of your life and lead you ever more deeply into the Father's love? Where do you need to surrender? And where do you need to struggle? Where is there something that is thrown across your path that you need to push out of the way with all of your strength and move toward God? Surrender and struggle. I think these are key questions for our walk of discipleship. Where do you need to surrender? Where do you need to struggle? You might ask each other these questions over lunch, right? Where are you surrendering? Where do you need to struggle? And in the case of Nicodemus, who came to meet with Jesus by night, he must have found his way clear. He must have surrendered and struggled and discovered his path into the light. Because it's interesting, in the Gospel of John, Nicodemus only turns up a handful of times. He's here at the beginning with Jesus. And another place that Nicodemus turns up is at the very end of the Gospel. It's him and Joseph of Arimathea who gently take the body of Jesus down from the cross. It's him and Joseph of Arimathea who carry Jesus to a fresh stone grave, wrap Jesus in linens and spices, and lay him there. Nicodemus shows up at the very end. He must have found his light. Have you? Amen.